My name is Emily Dawson. When I was just 19 years old, I was pushed into an arranged marriage with a man named Martin Cole. My mother came from a long line of business owners, and tradition mattered more than my feelings. I never loved Martin. He was 3 years older, the eldest son of a respected family, and worked for his father's company. I had no choice. He didn't either. His family had business interests tied up with mine. So we both signed up for a marriage that neither of us wanted. From the beginning, it was clear we weren't partners in any real sense. We didn't share dreams, goals, or even conversation. We tried to start a family early on, thinking that maybe having a child would bridge the gap between us. But after years of hospital visits and disappointment, it became clear that children weren't in our future. That's when things got worse. At first, Martin's parents were kind to me. They treated me like a proper daughter-in-law. But over time, their attitude shifted. Especially when it became apparent that I couldn't have children. They started calling me names, barren, useless, and acted as though I'd brought shame on their family. My father-in-law would snap cruelly, "You just need to try harder. We're wasting money on doctors." And Martin? He'd sit in the corner, reading the newspaper or dozing off while I was berated in his presence. I told him I wanted to get a job, to do something with my life, but he refused. "If you start working, people will think we're struggling financially," he said. He cared more about appearances than about my well-being. I was stuck, bound by family obligation, a loveless marriage, and cultural expectations that didn't leave room for independence. Still, I kept telling myself that one day, I'd be rewarded for my patience. That someday, something would change. But deep down, I was starting to realize, nothing ever would. Years passed, and my marriage to Martin remained a quiet misery. We shared a home but nothing else, no intimacy, no companionship, just routine. My days were spent cooking, cleaning, and tiptoeing around his mother, Caroline, who had become more bitter and cruel with age. She no longer bothered hiding her contempt for me. Her words cut deeper with each passing year. Then, everything changed, though not in the way I had hoped. When I was 43, Martin's father, Charles, died unexpectedly in a car accident. As tragic as it was, it uncovered something worse. The family business had been dodging taxes for years. Government auditors moved in like a storm. Between the unpaid taxes, penalties, and legal fees, the company was forced into bankruptcy. Most of our property and savings were seized. The only thing we managed to hold on to was the house. Martin, now 45, seemed paralyzed at first. His father had always protected him. Without that shield, I feared he'd sink completely. But in an unexpected twist, it was my parents who stepped in. They still had connections and arranged for Martin to get a job at a mid-size logistics firm. Thanks to them, he landed the position quickly. It was the first time in years he'd worked for someone other than his father. But while Martin's life moved forward, mine came to a complete halt. His mother, devastated by her husband's death and the loss of the business, spiraled into deep depression. Within a few months, she suffered a stroke. Suddenly, I became her full-time caregiver. She barely spoke. When she did, it was usually to blame me for everything that had gone wrong. Martin, of course, washed his hands of it. "She's your responsibility now," he said, as if that made any logical sense. On weekends, he stayed out late or lounged around while I fed, bathed, and monitored a woman who despised me. Any dreams I had of motherhood were now dead. At 43, I was exhausted. Trapped in a life I had never chosen, and now, there was no end in sight. After Caroline's stroke, I became more than just a housewife. I was now a full-time caregiver. Every morning, I helped her out of bed, prepared her meals, managed her medications, and handled her physical therapy. She couldn't do anything on her own anymore, and there was no one else willing to lift a finger. Martin, as usual, avoided everything. On his days off, he either slept until noon or made excuses to leave the house. Emily, I said gently one Saturday. Could you at least help feed your mother once a week? Just one meal? Martin groaned without even looking up from his phone. I work all week. I need my rest. If you want help, hire someone. We couldn't afford a full-time caregiver. My parents pitched in to send a nurse once a week, but beyond that, we were on our own. Still, I couldn't walk away. As much as I resented Caroline for her past cruelty, I couldn't abandon her now. It wasn't in my nature to turn my back on someone helpless, even if she had never shown me kindness. Martin, however, grew more distant. He started taking solo trips, telling neighbors that I was too demanding and wouldn't let him relax. The irony was staggering. He'd completely stepped away from his mother's care but complained about being burdened. The neighbors weren't fooled. They saw me walking Caroline in the garden, lifting her into the bath, hauling groceries, all while Martin vanished every weekend. Sometimes Caroline would mutter, "He doesn't come around because you're always here." And I would quietly ask, "Should I leave then?" She'd fall silent. She knew the truth. Without me, there would be no one. This went on for 19 more years. When Caroline finally passed away, I was nearly 60. I felt no grief, only relief. I had given nearly 4 decades to a man who barely acknowledged me and to a woman who never accepted me. And now, I was left with an empty house, a stranger for a husband, and the haunting realization that my youth had been spent serving people who never truly saw me. Caroline's passing marked the end of a chapter one never wanted to live. At 59, I no longer clung to the illusion that my marriage could improve. Martin and I had drifted so far apart, it felt like we were roommates, if even that. He spent most of his time at work or away from home. I stayed busy with small hobbies, like pottery, something just for myself at last. For a while, I tasted something close to peace. But Martin wasn't happy with that. "You're out playing while I work," he snapped one evening after noticing the handmade vase I brought home. "You should be doing the laundry, not wasting time on silly hobbies." I stayed calm until he did something unforgivable. One Saturday morning, I found the tote bag I always used for my pottery class in ashes in the backyard. Burned. Along with it were my tools and a small pouch that held some of my late mother's buttons, something I kept for sentimental reasons. Martin stood nearby, not even pretending to feel bad. "What the hell are you doing?" I yelled. "Don't get lost in your weird little hobbies. Just focus on the house." That night, I sat alone in the kitchen and cried. I had swallowed so much over the years. But this was different. He hadn't just disrespected my time, he had destroyed something that brought me a sliver of happiness. And he did it with no remorse. Just as the thought of divorce began to take root, tragedy struck again. My father passed away suddenly from a heart condition. 1 month later, my mother, already weak with grief, followed. It happened so quickly, I barely had time to process it. The grief overwhelmed me. After the second funeral, I collapsed. For an entire week, I couldn't get out of bed. My friends from pottery class called and checked on me. "Martin?" He rolled his eyes. "How long are you going to mope? Must be nice to nap all day while I'm working." That was the moment something inside me shifted. I realized I wasn't mourning just my parents, I was mourning the life I never got to live. A few days after my mother's funeral, I remembered I needed to finalize a payment to the funeral home. My brother, Nathan, had taken over our family's business and was swamped with work, so I'd promised to handle the payment. I pulled out the bank book my mother had left behind and was reviewing the balance when Martin walked by. He paused, glanced at the booklet, and immediately smirked. "So, how much did your mom leave you?" His tone was sharp, greedy, even. Not a hint of sympathy. "No, are you okay, or how are you holding up?" Just that question. "About 2 million, I said quietly, not bothering to hide the coldness in my voice. "That's it?" Martin scoffed. Well, after taxes you should still have a decent chunk left. He smiled. But it wasn't a kind smile, it was a calculated one. I could feel it in my gut. He thought that money was already his. I tucked the bank book away and didn't say another word. That night, I went to bed early, exhausted from grief and disgusted by the man I had spent nearly 4 decades with. Martin didn't say goodnight. He didn't even check on me. The house was eerily quiet. The next morning, something felt off. After breakfast, Martin said he had errands and left like usual. But around noon, I got a call from his workplace. Martin hadn't shown up. They were worried, it was completely out of character. Worried myself, I tried calling him. No answer. I paced the living room and then froze. There, on the table, was a divorce form, already filled out. My heart dropped. I rushed to where I'd hidden the bank book. It was gone. It wasn't an accident. Martin had left on purpose. He thought he was being clever, vanishing with the bank book, assuming he'd secured my inheritance. But he didn't know the whole story. The money wasn't even accessible without the proper paperwork only I could provide. I took a deep breath, picked up the divorce papers, and walked out the door. It was time to end this. Officially, and on my terms. That same afternoon, I went straight to the city office and submitted the divorce papers. I wasn't angry anymore, just done. After years of being ignored, insulted, and used, I felt strangely calm as I signed away my marriage. I informed Martin's workplace that I had no idea where he was and promised to update them if I heard anything. They thanked me politely and marked him as on paid leave. I couldn't help but feel a pang of envy. He still had a job, thanks to my family's connections, no less. Once the divorce was finalized, I packed up my essentials. My next destination was the one place that had always brought me comfort, my family's old house. With my parents gone and my brother settled with his own family, the home had been left to me. It was a quiet, beautiful property, full of memories and love, everything my married life had lacked. Just as I finished folding the last of my clothes, my phone rang. It was Martin. I didn't answer. He kept calling. Then the house phone started ringing. It was so relentless, I finally picked up. "What do you want?" I asked flatly. His voice came through panicked. "Emily, I can't withdraw the money. The bank won't let me touch it." I nearly laughed. "Of course they won't," I said. "You need my ID, and that was in the pottery bag you set on fire. Remember?" Martin went silent. "And even if you had it, the account hasn't been transferred to me yet. I told you I'd handle the paperwork, but you were too busy scheming." I went to the bank. "And they said I wasn't the heir," he shouted, desperate now. "That's because you're not," I said calmly. "You're not in the will. You never were. And now you're not even my husband." I hung up the phone. It was the first time in decades I felt power shift back to me. He had gambled on my silence and lost everything. The next morning, I headed to the bank to take care of the remaining funeral costs and finalize the transfer of my mother's assets. I planned to arrive early, assuming Martin wouldn't dare show his face after our last call. But I was wrong. As I stepped out of the car and approached the entrance, I heard someone call out, "Emily." It was Martin. "I figured you'd show up here eventually," he said, trying to sound casual, but his face was pale and tight with frustration. I ignored him and walked toward the entrance, but he kept talking, begging for a second chance, as if the divorce hadn't happened. I didn't bother responding. As I pushed open the glass door, another voice caught me by surprise. "Is that you, Emily?" I turned. Standing just a few feet away was a man I barely recognized at first, Martin's younger brother, Ryan. I'd only seen him a few times over the course of my marriage. He had cut ties with the family years ago. The last time we spoke was at their mother's funeral. I'm here to check on Mom's old accounts, Ryan said, glancing between us. She mentioned something before she passed, about investment trusts and a safety deposit box. Martin's eyes widened. Wait, what? He asked, stunned. Ryan nodded. She left me a message a while back. Told me if anything happened to her, I should handle the details. Took me a while, but I finally got around to it. What came next floored me. There was a letter in the deposit box, Ryan continued. Mom wrote that she wanted everything in there, jewelry, the investments, to go to you, Emily. She said you were the one who cared for her when no one else did. I stared at him, speechless. Martin's jaw dropped. Ryan pulled out a folded letter on familiar stationery I had once gifted Caroline long ago. I remembered offering to help her write thank you notes, and she had brushed me off. Now I understood why. She knew Martin would try to take it, Ryan said. That's why she kept it quiet. For the first time in forever, I felt something entirely new, validation. I stood there in stunned silence, the weight of Ryan's words sinking in. After everything, after decades of cold glares, harsh words, and thankless care, Caroline had left her final wishes in my name. Even if she had never said it out loud, she had seen me. She had known. Next to me, Martin was visibly shaking. His eyes darted between me and Ryan as if trying to find a loophole in a decision that had already been made. But she never said anything to me. Martin stammered. I'm her son. Why would she leave everything to Emily? Ryan stayed calm. She told me she didn't trust you. Said if she mentioned it, you'd find a way to twist it. So she put it in writing and left it for me to deliver. Martin tried to argue. That letter isn't a legal will. It won't hold up. Maybe not in court, Ryan admitted. But Mom asked me to do the right thing. And I will. The bank staff escorted us to a private office. While I reissued the bank book and completed the funeral payment, Martin sat outside. Slouched in a chair like a sulking child. He had no role to play anymore. Not as my husband. Not as Caroline's heir. Just a man with nothing left to manipulate. A few days later, Ryan called to update me. Martin had attempted to dispute the inheritance again, but after consulting with a lawyer, he gave up. The jewelry and remaining investments were officially handed over to me. Ryan, who had no interest in the estate, honored his mother's wishes without complaint. But Martin wasn't done. One afternoon, he showed up at the family home, my home now, looking completely defeated. He knelt at my doorstep, tears in his eyes. I made a mistake, Emily. Please, let's start over. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply looked him in the eyes and said, there was never love between us, Martin. What is there to start over from? For the first time in my life, I closed the door, not to keep someone out, but to finally let myself in. After shutting the door on Martin, for good, I felt something I hadn't in years, peace. Real, quiet peace. Not just the absence of yelling or cold shoulders, but a sense of clarity that wrapped around me like sunlight after a storm. Martin continued to call for a while. He never came back to the house after that last visit, but I knew he was spiraling. Ryan later told me Martin had stopped showing up to work without notifying anyone. Eventually, they had to let him go. It didn't surprise me. Without someone else to impress or sponge off of, Martin no longer had a reason to keep up the facade of responsibility. I used to think he worked hard out of duty, turns out it was just pride. And now even that had crumbled. Ryan apologized on behalf of his family, words I never expected to hear. Especially from someone who had distanced himself from it all. You shouldn't have had to go through what you did, he said quietly. But I hope this gives you a new start. And it did. I returned to pottery class, where my old friends welcomed me back with warmth. For the first time, I wasn't just passing the time, I was living in it. I took long walks through the garden my mother had loved. I read books without worrying about dinner burning. I filled the silence of the house with soft music, not tension. Then, something unexpected happened. I met someone, kind, patient, and nothing like Martin. At first, I told myself it was just friendship. But over time, it became something more. I had sworn off marriage. But maybe love could feel different when it's real. I once thought I'd grow old as a servant in a cold marriage. But life had other plans. It may have taken nearly 60 years. But I found my freedom. My joy. My voice. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. It's never too late to choose yourself.